Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, Kushal Mehra. My guest today is Dr. Pallavi Guha, and we're going to be talking about her book here, hashtag Me Too in India. Pallavi, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on your show, Kushal, especially on International Women's Day. Very excited to be here.
All right. It couldn't have been a more perfect day to do this podcast. So, Pallavi, before we talk about the book, I'll request you to tell everybody a bit about yourself.
Sure. My name is Pallavi Guha, and good evening to everyone. In India, I am in the East Coast, so it's nice and bright, sunny morning. It's 9 a.m. here. So if you have viewers from other parts of the world, then good morning to you. So I am currently a journalism professor. I teach journalism and new media at Towson University, but I'm also a former journalist, and I've been in the profession like journalist, journalism professor, journalism educator, researcher. I've been doing this for the past almost 17 years now. And I got my PhD from the University of Maryland. I focused on anti-rape and anti-sexual harassment, violence and activism on social media and news media platform. And today we are going to be talking about my book, which is an offset of my PhD that I finished about 4 years ago. So it was an offset. So I'm really excited to talk about it all the more because I have seen the evolution, how it has changed when I started working on it, and now like after like several years. So I have really lived the change while I was working on this book as well. Um, yeah, so that's pretty much about it.
So I just had this question. So Pallavi, because obviously this book was an extension of your PhD or your education as such.
Right.
But so I know this question is very cliched kind of a thing because and I ask this to everyone who writes a book, but I genuinely am interested because I want to understand the mind of the author or why they pick a particular topic and why A not B. So why did you decide A to do the PhD itself in this subject, and then how did it go about getting converted into the book?
Sure. So I'll start with why I decided to do a PhD. When I moved here, I've been a journalist for a long time, not just in India but also in the UK. So I was working in several newsrooms, and then I moved here with my husband and to the US, and then I was working as a freelance journalist. Then we had our daughter, and between all of these, I kind of started looking at how I could expand my career, not just in journalism, but also in journalism scholarship, journalism academia, journalism education, which was something very new to me. Because I worked as a journalist, but I was trained as a journalist in the newsrooms. I never had any journalism degree when when I started working. My academic background is in policy, international relations. So, and the fact that here there is so much focus on journalism scholarship and journalism research and education, it was like, mind boggling for me. So my parents, they really encouraged me a lot, especially my dad. He told me that, if you want to pursue this, then you should go for it. And my husband has been also very supportive. So there I kind of, I started looking at programs, and that was the initiation. And once in the program, I also taught as guest lecturers a couple of classes. And it was very different. I had never imagined, as an undergrad back in India, I had never imagined that I would have a career in academia. But, you think something and then, something else happens. So that was my initiation into academia. And it just, I started writing scholarly articles and works, which is very different from journalistic writing. So I had to relearn myself and relearn the writing as well, how I could express everything, just scholarship without any bias and objectively reading scholarly articles, and also understanding journalism, how as a profession it was changing, because then it was changing. When I was working as a journalist, there was no Twitter. Facebook was new. So I was also looking at the evolution and, chatting with some of my former colleagues, how that was impacting newsrooms. So everything came together, and so I spent several years and finally got the PhD, which was lot of hard work and sacrifices as well. Talking about the topic, why I became interested. So engaging in this kind of research, writing and researching about sexual violence and how the media narrative is formed, it's kind of been an extension of my catharsis. And it started even before I kind of started collecting interviews and started writing about my data for this thesis. So it started way back in 2014, 2015. So that was the first time when I started looking at these topics, and I became interested. Like, what is it that social media is influencing when we are talking about anti-sexual violence narratives, anti-sexual violence activism on social media platforms? If there has been any change on news media platforms. And then what really intrigued me that after 2012, so 2012 is considered a watershed movement in anti-rape and anti-sexual violence movement, right, in feminist activism. So it kind of triggered me and intrigued me that what makes #Nirbhaya build a public agenda, a public narrative, political policies, and what neglects the others, which I also write about, such as, Jisha, and so many others who are not talked about. There is no movement for them. There are no candlelight marches. So I really wanted to understand this gap that is created. Like, what makes something so viral and becomes like part of public memory, public agenda, and what just, neglects the others. So that was how I started working on my thesis and on my on my doctoral study. But once I had finished writing, #MeToo happened in 2017. So I really then wanted to understand from the lens of #MeToo, if anything I had missed previously, or if anything was different as far as anti-sexual violence activism is considered. Because 2012 was, 5 years ago? 2017 when #MeToo happened. So 5 years, it's like light years in terms of social media platforms. Access, it has improved. Social media platforms, they have evolved. More people are online everywhere, not just in India. More people have access to these platforms. They have access to smartphones, and more platforms are available. So I just wanted to see that if #MeToo made any kind of changes. Did it help in closing the gap? Because now more people are there. Are we seeing more public narrative, public agenda on the others who were left behind previously? So that was how I started working towards the book. But once I started working, then #MeToo India happened. So I had to change gears again to do the interviews.
So just to understand, so from a writing perspective, so I'll give you my experience when I used to read a lot of philosophy material. So I'll give you an example. Let's say David Chalmers, right? David Chalmers will write a book. So one book would be written for his fellow academics, and one book is written for the normal public. And I would read both, just being a student of philosophy. So you just tend to read both to understand what is the difference. So from your own perspective as a writer, as you say, you go from a journalism career back into academia to do a PhD and then back into writing books. Now, how does one change or flip around in the writing cycle as such? So how does one manage that? So what would be the difference, let's say, if you're writing a PhD paper or you're writing a book?
Right. So one of the things I would say, which my advisor also, she said after reading the book, that it does not feel or read like an academic thesis or a doctoral thesis at all after adding so much material. It's a cycle in the sense I included a lot of my personal experiences when I was writing the book, which I had not included. And I was more open, not just as an academic, but also as an author. Like, I went through a lot of ethical dilemmas, which I included in the book, whether when I was interviewing the feminist activists or the journalists, was I making them relive their trauma of reporting, covering? So, or it's time, it's an investment for them to speak with me, right? So all of these various ethical dilemmas I was going through, I have been very clear about these in the book, and that I think that helped me to connect with my audience, with the readers. I have also included, I've been very open about it, like why I did not include child sexual abuse or child sexual rape, because I'm a mother of an 11-year-old daughter. I could not bear myself to go through the coverage. I just could not, and I've been open about it. I have been open about when I faced sexual harassment on the streets, like how I reacted. What would have been any different if there was social media platforms? There weren't any social media platforms. So I have had these conversations, not just in my mind, but I have written about them. So I think that's the basic difference. I've tried to be more open as an individual, as a person, not just someone who's writing, who's reading all these academic journals, papers, and news articles, but also someone who is sharing the writing process. So that's the primary difference, I would say.
So now let's go into this area of the book, because I think it's very important to understand for anybody who might go forward and read your book, is what are the research methods and the tools that you use. Because once you start the book, you do talk about using Lyon's rationalization of creating alliances within the global system. Now, why did you use that tool, or what is that tool, and what was so unique about that tool and methodology?
Sure. So, like I mentioned in the book, primarily I've used feminist media methodologies, like I mixed methods. So not just I have relied on the interviews, but I've also done like network analysis, like Facebook pages, the handles, and then narratives, coverage, newspaper articles, and so on. And I have explained the reason behind why I chose certain why I chose the sexual violence and rapes that I chose to study. So let me start with the interviews. Heavily, I focused on interviews. So for 3 years, from 2016 until 2019, I managed to do like 75 interviews of journalists, as well as anti-sexual feminist activists, and that helped me to understand their perspective. How do they use social media platforms when they are doing activism related to anti-sexual violence activism? How do they use social media platforms when journalists are reporting on it? And so before I constructed the questions, I made sure I read all the most of the articles, the newspaper articles, right? And you've already read the book, so the rapes I chose were from 2005 until 2018, right? And it's a big range. It's a big range, and I wanted to choose it because I wanted to understand what has changed between 2012, before 2012, and now. Social media before and now. So that's why I just chose those rapes and sexual violence, because I wanted to understand the activism behind it. Talking about the other research tools, you talked about the global systems, the global alliances. So I wanted to study these handles on Facebook, specifically on Facebook, because Facebook has a wider reach as compared to Twitter. At least when I was studying it. So it has a more like wider reach, and especially rural and semi-rural activists, they told me they're mostly on Facebook. Even if they use it sparsely, they're on Facebook. Like Twitter doesn't work for them for some reason. And you can tell me more about it, how Twitter works, and what you have seen from your perspective. So I've seen that the movements, some of the transnational movements, they do have the ability to travel. So I wanted to study when they are traveling from one space to another. For instance, a slut walk. as a movement. It traveled. It initiated in Canada, but it traveled to all the spaces, right? So I wanted to understand. Yes, they are able to travel, but how far are they reaching in the global South, right? So I have to study who is resharing their content, who are the nodes that they are most interacting with, right? And I found that they are able to travel, but the sustainability, whether they are able to sustain and how far they are able to reach, is based on local access related issues, economic issues, and social factors. So that's one of the reasons why I decided to choose the network analysis as well, because I was trying to understand all the spaces, news, social media, as well as through my interactions, my interviews with people who are doing the work, who are there on the ground.
Yeah, so something that really stood out for me in your book was, and I want to read this quote from your first chapter, where you say, there were many other challenges along the way. I decided not to include politically affiliated feminist activists in the interview process because, as a former journalist, I found that in India, they tend to be heavily influenced by the political ideology of their parties, and their actions depend on whether their party is in power. Their actions would be motivated by the party line and not by the true calling of activism. So, can you shine a little bit of light on why you chose this particular line?
Sure, definitely. And I have also, cited myself. I wrote an article. This is like, I have covered elections in India when I used to stay there. And this comes from one of my experiences. And I have, like I said, I cited myself. So during one of the elections, one of the parties, they only gave like if I remember correctly, 2 seats to women in out of 40 or 45, and I forgot at this point. It's cited there, out of 40 or 45 seats. And this is one of the parties which talks a lot about women's empowerment, 30% reservation, and so on. So when I was doing this, I looked at the list and I was doing this story. I called up the women's wing. All the parties, they have a women's wing. And I spoke to the person who's heading the women's wing. I asked her, so what is it like? Your party does support 30% reservation, or supports empowerment. So why is it that you have 2 seats only? And I understand the complications, and that possibly they have to defend the party. So she went on to tell me that when we are distributing tickets, we don't look at anything. We don't look at identities. We don't look at anything. We just look at the winnability of the candidate. So that was like whatever question I ask. So that was to me, it was very revealing. Very revealing. So, and it's also kind of telling that they're going to stick with their party lines, whatever it is. So that's why it was a very conscious decision that I did not include anyone from the women's wings, from any party whatsoever. And while I was doing the research, I really wanted my focus to be on feminist activists who do a lot of work but who are not heard of. And I do want to give credit to a book that I read, Playing with Fire. It's published by Richa Nagar and 7 grassroots activists. They are not feminist activists, but activists in India, and they co-write. And I've been so inspired by this book, and that's why I also focused on grassroots feminist activists. They write about the hierarchy in the hierarchy in the system, and how they do a lot of work, but they never get, they are still relegated in the background. And that book opened my eyes, literally opened my eyes. And I also wanted to focus very similarly on the activists who do so much work in the rural and semi-rural areas without without even thinking, or without even any expectation that others are going to talk about them, write about them. They don't care about it, but they are working. And that was eye-opening for me when I was doing these interviews.
So you use a word called the heterogeneous feminist movement in India. Could you explain that bit a little bit? Well, so
Sure.
what do you mean when you say the heterogeneous movement of India?
Sure. So there is this, how do I put it? So there is this thing, like feminist movement is constructed as a very if you are a feminist, or if you are a believer in the feminist movement, then you are type A or you are type B. You kind of categorize and you typify the movement. So my idea is to identify that it's a heterogeneous movement. It's a very diverse movement. So the feminist activists I spoke with, who are mostly in the rural areas, I don't even remember once that they referred anything about feminism. But they are feminists. They are very strong women who are working for other women in their communities without any expectation, right? So to think about it that, feminist movement or feminism is one type only, then I think it's a disservice. So we have to recognize that it's a very diverse movement, very heterogeneous. What feminism looks in the urban areas in India, it doesn't look the same way in the rural or semi-rural areas.
So long story short, there are feminists and then there are feminists.
There are.
Yeah, so it's like, there are some people who just go about doing their job, the fighting for what they believe is right, without act so if I was to understand that, they don't attach a label to their job, but they just go about doing their job. And then there are some people who attach a label and do their job, and then there are some people who just have the label and do nothing.
Yeah, there are those kinds as well. And I know that because one of my interviewees, she's like, she's not on social media at all, but she does fabulous work, and she still does. I mean, and she has had so much personal sacrifices. And she works mostly in the semi-rural and rural areas in West Bengal. And she told me in one of the chats, she has been working hard, but someone else came and took some photographs and they posted on social media platforms claiming to be, their work. And I told her, why didn't you say, well, I don't have the time to, say anything on this, because I am not on social media as much. And if that person wants to take credit, let it be. I just want to work.
Yeah, but don't you think this is also a form of intellectual fraud?
This is a fraud at all levels.
So,
This is, I
yeah,
mean,
so it's ridiculous. I mean, if I was to, it's like, I get reminded, I know, I try to keep things light also in the podcast. I got reminded of that, Andaz Apna Apna ka scene where, Jagdeep shouts at Salman Khan, kamau main udaye ye, kamau main udaye ye, kind of a thing. Kaam koi aur kar raha hai, credit koi aur leke ja raha hai, which is so typical of many things, that the way the cookie crumbles in India, where there are real grassroots activists. I know, as someone who's been involved in some kind of socio-political activism now for more than a decade, I have seen many times, I go and meet. So I know this kid, we used to have a larger project, and one of the sub projects was going into slums and identifying kids who are begging on the streets. It's a very dangerous job, taking them out of the job of begging, because there's a mafia directly involved in it. And I remember that child, I would be like, तू आजा, मैं तेरे से बात करता हूँ. बोलता भैया आपके नाम पे रखो. मैंने बोला क्यों? बोलता मुझे टपका देंगे. सो वहां पे था कि मुझे मार ही डालेंगे जो मैं काम कर रहा हूँ. तो भैया आपको मारेंगे नहीं, आपको सिर्फ धमकाएंगे. This was the level. So he did not want the attention for many things. But then I also found many cases where these people deserved the attention and they would not get it. So I actually, when I was reading the book, I immediately could relate to what you're talking about, was because I have seen it in my own work when I do work in slums in Mumbai, or if I go to rural India, and it's pathetic. But another thing that stood out for me was, you talk about this. This is just a theoretical query, but I think, I wanted to share it on the podcast.
sure.
Was you say the most prevalent form of reporting news of rape involves the whore and virgin dichotomy,
Right.
where you say the assaulted woman is a powerless object who has been violated. Now what exactly is this dichotomy, and how is the framing done, and what is the potential downside of it?
Sure. So let me put it this way. So there are various ways, frameworks that when I was studying the rape coverage, that when I was studying, I found out. So one of the most, like you point out, common is the whore virgin. Like first, there could be the whore would be, asking what was she doing, blaming, and those sorts of things. And the virgin would be, oh, she's an angelic virgin, and she has no agency of her own, and she has been raped, without taking into account the various structural or other issues, like, let's say, for example, how did it happen, whether it's a stranger rape, whether it is related to safety, or whether it's a socio-politically motivated thing. So there are so many other factors. If you put it so simplistically, you are not really going in depth, right? And one of the things that I found through interviews with the journalists, that after 2012, this whore virgin framework has reduced quite a bit, because they would get called out on social media platforms. So now what has happened, because they are being called out and they don't want to be called out, they're avoiding the whore virgin framing of rapes and sexual violence. But the quantity has increased a little bit, but the quality, to investigate what are the other issues, that why is it happening, that is still not there. That's the primary focus is still missing from the structural issues. Like, why is it happening? How is it related? What are the several other factors that are leading to sexual violence, that are leading to rapes and sexual harassment? So those things are still missing.
So now I want to get into what you call feminist theorizing in India in your second chapter, where you talk about rape news coverage in India. Personally, this was my favorite chapter in the book, because this opened my eyes to, look, what happens is you're just consuming news without looking at it from a theoretical perspective. To be very honest, I mean, I don't blame people for that, because I mean, why would they theorize the news, right? They'll just look at the news and they will just experience the emotions as and when they're watching the news, or whether it's on digital medium or on a medium like a newsroom or something of that sort, or the print medium, whatever it is.
Right.
But so you actually get into the details of it, and again, I took out a few quotes about that. Was one thing that particularly stood out for me is you talk about something called the interdependent agenda building model. Now, what is that? Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So I've been since the time I started studying and analyzing, writing about sexual violence, rapes, and sexual harassment, and how social media and news media platforms, they impact not just the coverage but agenda, the public agenda. This is a concept that I've developed. So what is interdependent agenda building? So I kind of focus on the association, the interdependent association between social media networks as well as mass media platforms, and that only when they work together, they have the ability to build a public agenda, especially in digitally emerging spaces. And I've given like several examples how, when either one kind of works, like if it's only mass media, then a certain section gets is not involved. If it's only digital media, social media platforms, a certain section, it doesn't get involved. So in digitally emerging spaces, both need to work. And why, I will tell you. So there is no doubt that social media platforms, it empowers the victims and survivors to share their experiences. But we have to acknowledge that even sharing sexual violence or sexual harassment experiences on social media platforms, it's a privilege. And why do I say it's a privilege? I don't say privilege because of access. It's not that, people don't have access to digital media. Even when they have access, it's a privilege. And I'm going to give you one example, quoting from one of the grassroots feminist activists, Shutapa. She works. And what she said that the girls and young women in rural, semi-rural, where she works in West Bengal, they know that, there is, they have access to social media platforms. They were looking at #MeToo, #MeToo India. but they cannot use their, like when they are sexually harassed on their way to schools or colleges, they can't share those on social media platforms. Why? Because the moment they will share, the way to protect them, their family is going to say, okay, why don't you finish through correspondence? She said, in Bengali, she said, "Barite boshiye debe," matlab ghar pe bitha denge. So that's a way to protect, right? So it's a privilege to share experiences on social media platforms. So say in this context, we have to, and then, on the other hand, let me just finish my thought and then I'll say how it's kind of related. When #MeTooIndia happened, we saw that several women, they shared their experiences, sexual harassment experiences that happened in newsrooms. So of course they were not reported by the news, right? Then. So they needed those platforms. So we need both the platforms to work together if we want to make any changes or kind of any public agenda related changes, policy changes. And that is what worked for that is what happened after Jyoti Singh's brutal rape and murder. And that's why #Nirbhaya was so popular. And it like when I was studying like the number of Facebook comments, like, and I compared with the others, like there was no comparison at all. It was like so many times more it was received by the people, because there was a push both from the news media as well as from the social media platforms. So that's why I say that it's kind of you need to have both of them, and both of them need to depend on each other, interdependent agenda building, to make sure that there is an agenda, public agenda, that is built, so that if the public feels that it should be taken forward, then it's taken forward and a policy happens.
All right, now I want to talk about, so I'm going to read another quote, although this quote is from chapter 2, but I think it fits into chapter 3 in my opinion.
Okay.
So you write, I face similar hierarchical gatekeeping from some of the nonprofits. Right. I was refused any contact with the field workers, and only the founder president wanted to meet. When the office of the founder president called to reschedule the appointment, I asked if I could go and observe the field workers and see how they worked during the meeting. Not only was my request denied, but I was told categorically that the meeting was to be only with the founder president and no one else. Of course, the meeting was never scheduled. Rural feminist activists have come across gatekeeping and barriers while trying to use social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook. Most prefer to use WhatsApp and still try to use Facebook to build an agenda and network with journalists, which now takes me to your third chapter of the book, where you have appropriately titled it, where you call it "The Heart Does Not Bleed for Everyone: Selective Outrage and Activism." Now, this actually blows my mind. मतलब एक तो वैसे ही हमारे देश में हमारी ठुकी पड़ी है, इतना सीरियस सब्जेक्ट है, उसमें भी गेट कीपिंग और selectivity. I mean, how the hell?
lot of gatekeeping and hierarchy, and that kind of reaffirmed. Isilia, I never went back to the bigger organizations, and I tried to focus on the grassroots level feminist activists. And yeah, you just read it. This is what I faced. So I was in India and I scheduled a couple of meetings, and this was one of the meetings. And what I really wanted to do was see how the field workers, they work, and also interview the founder president of the organization. And like I say, I was like a day or two before, or that day, now I forget, it's been some years, they called and they said that it's not going to happen. And all I wanted really to see how the field workers, they were working during the meetings, what were they sharing, whether they were using social media platforms. But that did not happen, and because I think I broached the subject, I never got a call back. But I did want to share this just to show that the feminist activists, even they are used, like they are victims of gatekeeping as well. So one of the feminist activists, she prior to this, like prior to her working by herself, she used to give her time to another organization. And just her time. And it's not that she told me that she didn't get paid. She would just get paid for transport and food, like a per diem kind of a thing. And she does a lot of other things, like she teaches self-defense as well. But she was told that whatever she did, she could not share it with others. Like whatever work she did with the organization and for the activism, that she couldn't share with others. She could not even she couldn't even share it on social media platforms. So she was very upset, and she was like, okay, then I'll just work on my own. And that's the kind of gatekeeping that I'm talking about. And this is very similar to the book that I was talking about, that was written in 2005, Richa Nagar and the other 7 other women playing with fire. This is the exact same thing that they talk about as well: gatekeeping in activism, in grassroots level work. So to me, it was kind of a reaffirmation that it's still working. It's still the same way. Why am I not surprised? Right?
Yeah, but it's ridiculous. I mean, what do they get beyond, I call it the honored and humbled syndrome, where, how it is on Facebook, right? Everybody is like, आज मैं एक celebrity को मिला, वो उसके साथ photo खींचता है, selfie लेता है, Facebook पे डालता है, and they always write honored and humbled. वर्ड भी नहीं चेंज होता, हर टाइम हर इंसान दुनिया में ऑनर्ड एंड हम्बल्ड ही हो रहा है. अरे कम से कम ओवरवेल्म्ड हो जा. मैंने एक बार मेरे दोस्त को बोला, तू क्यों ऑनर्ड एंड हम्बल हो रहा है? ओवरवेल्म्ड हो. बोलता नहीं, मैं ऑनर्ड एंड हम्बल्ड ही हूंगा. सो इज दिस आल्सो सम सॉर्ट ऑफ अ थिंग दैट एवरीबody wants to control the other? So in a very weird way, Pallavi, what I'm observing when I was reading your book, I was telling myself, these women are fighting for the freedom of women, but they really don't want to free these women.
I think it's about, like I say, I don't know if they don't want to free the women, but they want to maintain their hierarchy, like go through me. They want to maintain the gatekeeping. So, they like the hierarchy. I am at the top and you are there. Like, you continue to be there and just do like whatever I am asking you to do. And they do want the spotlight to be on them. So that's why we still have the hierarchy and gatekeeping. So I don't know. I'm sure they are working for the good of women, but not sharing the spotlight and, being a part of the hierarchy is problematic. And talking about gatekeeping on social media platforms, I do want to give one example. And that's why the women, they also don't use a lot of social media on rural in rural spaces and semi-rural spaces. So one of the activists, she had taken a video and some pictures of like there was a street harassment that was happening, and she took those pictures and she said that, okay, don't ever dare to harass that girl, and she put it on Facebook. Because it was like, there's this guy where he was trying to pull the dupatta of the girl, and she took the photograph and she put it on Facebook on her profile. And she said, today we if anyone is doing this to you, then let us know. We want to help you. And today we were able to stop something like this happen. And someone saw like who was involved, and they reported the post as nudity. It was taken down. Second time she did it, it was taken down again, and her profile was blocked. And she's like, I don't know how to use Facebook that well. And
this is actually a serious issue. So you actually would not know, because let me tell you, I don't understand Facebook rules. I don't understand Twitter rules. I mean, I don't know beyond the point. Then how do these people solve this dichotomy? Because Facebook and Twitter claim to be fighting for the, the one at the bottom of the ladder or the bottom of the rung, but are they in a weird way? Because they formulate these rules. This is how our bureaucrats work in India. They could write the law in one page, but they write a pothi. And then they write the pothi so that their anointed people can be the gatekeepers of Saab kaam karwa ke lena. So in a way, it's like, social media giants are now having their own gatekeepers where, ha bhai, main tujhe batata hu, tu aise kaam kar. Then how does this help activism then?
So that's why the rural activists, like I say, like it's and semi-rural activists, it's for them it's very difficult to be on these social media platforms. But I don't know. Would you consider WhatsApp to be a social media platform? They love working on WhatsApp because they can.
I can
So
vouch for
that's
that. I can vouch for that. Again, whatever
so
little work I have done, WhatsApp is creating magic in India, because what happens is they just send that video immediately
right.
and it goes to that person directly. I mean, I can give you my own experience from running a factory where my workers, in fact, it is kind of my bane. I was like, sometimes I have to tell them, "Arey, pura time WhatsApp mein baitha rehta hai, kuch aur bhi kar le." It's like they're always, everybody is constantly on WhatsApp. WhatsApp is our national pastime.
But WhatsApp is also helping them. So one
Yeah.
of the participants, she told me, "Arey Didi, WhatsApp se hum kar lete hain." So that's why they are not on Twitter. Facebook sometimes, the other feminist activist I was speaking with, she said, "Oh, Facebook, I have a profile. I don't check much, and I keep in touch with them through WhatsApp as well." So they're just a call away. That's how I did the interviews too. So and it also helps them in other ways, like if nothing is working and they want to contact a journalist, and mostly it's not the English newsrooms, the English media, they are connected with the local media journalists, so they use WhatsApp, like this has happened, would you be interested? And I will come back to the earlier point I made. So that's why you need an interdependent agenda building. You can't leave behind anyone. So if you don't have both, then there are these blind spots and gaps.
I want to pick on. So you just, in a passing reference, you spoke about the media. Again, I want
Right.
to read a quote from your book, which
Right.
basically pissed me off till the extent that I wanted to do something, like literally. So I was really disturbed when I read this part. So you've written, Amit, obviously the name is a pseudonym, a senior journalist working for an English newspaper, said,
Mm-hmm.
a molestation or alleged rape that occurred in a slum by shanty dwellers will usually not get much coverage or any coverage at all. Editors frequently brush them aside as being not newsworthy. But such an allegation in a high profile or social elite class family will attract huge attention. It is mainly on the profile of the victim and the nature of the crime. What kind of monsters do this?
It's just very sad. Very, very sad and disappointing. And like you said, I've used a lot of pseudonyms because
I
during
get
the
it.
interviews they were like, not everyone is comfortable sharing their names, so I've used a lot of pseudonyms, and I have identified who are the ones that I've used pseudonyms. And Amit is not the only one who said, like, Amit said this in the context of urban slums and shanties, but there are other journalists who said the same things about rural and semi-rapes and sexual violence happening in rural and semi-rural areas. So one journalist also said a similar thing, that if a sexual violence happened in a rural or semi-rural areas, it would be pushed back in some pages, like in the page 4 or page 5, and not on page 1. And that's partly because a lot depends on who your readers are, so it's very commodified, right? The industry's, so who your readers are. So they think, okay, if this has happened in a rural or semi-rural areas, or in a slum or a shanty, would our readers be interested in reading about it? It is very unfortunate, very disappointing, but it is how it works. It used to work, at least. And if it's a high profile, like if it's happening in the heart of the city, then there are a lot of questions about the safety of women, safety of the readers who are reading. So they will connect more, and they will read the story more, they would be more interested. So that's why either it is not picked up, or it is picked up later, depending on the news busyness of the news cycle or the news, or it is relegated to a page which is like further down, or somewhere inside. But one of the other journalists also say that the power of being Facebookish, that means social media has kind of helped a little bit in this instance. Like they call out if someone knows that why are you not writing about this, or there are call outs. So now things are moving maybe towards it, that they include, there is a focus that, we should not be neglecting them. But at the same time, I would say that where it is treated equitably, that's still a day to come. Like we still need to make a lot of progress there.
Another dichotomy that you talk about is the dichotomy on being a journalist or an activist, right? Now, I'll be very open. One of the biggest reasons I've stopped watching news in India, especially political news in India, I'm just being very honest. I've not seen a single mainstream media news outlet now for 6+ years. I find them abhorrent. I find them to be a bane on humanity, where they're shouting and screaming at each other, and they're agenda driven, because they're not journalists, they are activists. Now, here's the weird scenario. But in something as sensitive as sexual assault, while you would want a person to be a journalist, but you would also want a person to be an activist. You would. I'm being very honest here. Like, you can't go about talking about issues like this on a day-to-day basis in a newspaper or in a mainstream media channel without having an activist like zeal in you, because it's a very depressing scenario when you cover something like this, because you're constantly surrounded by horrendous news, horrific news. You're always in stress, you're always under pressure as a human being. So how does one do that? Because I obviously don't want that in political news reporting. I don't want activism in science reporting. But if somebody is kind of activisty in this area, which is like sexual assault, I really won't mind beyond I don't want it to be absolute activism. I do want some base level journalism existing there too, where I just want to know the facts of the case first. But how does one draw that line then?
It's a very good question, Kushal. Thank you for asking that. And I think it's also very important. So from what I found from the interviews, and I will say that again, so most of the male journalists, they identified themselves only as journalists. Like even and I kind of specifically asked them only about sexual harassment and sexual violence and rape while covering them such issues, and they saw themselves only as journalists. As far as the activists, some of the activists, they were former journalists, and because of their experiences of sexual harassment in the newsrooms, they now have become activists. But no one who are like currently in newsrooms, they don't identify themselves as activists, but they do identify that it being a woman or having faced sexual harassment in various ways, street harassment or so, it kind of makes them more sensitive towards asking some questions. And let me give you an example. I also do this in my class when I'm teaching. And I feel that I can ask these questions because I do the same thing. So when I'm asking my class, how many of you, if it's like after sundown, you keep your phone handy and you keep looking back if it's an empty space? Most of my female students will raise their hands, not my male students. I can ask that question because I do the same thing, right? So, sensitizing, it's not about activism, but it's about lived experience. So I can ask that question, put it into perspective because I do it, right? How many of you previously, I used to carry pepper spray. Then how many of you carry like pepper spray when it's like, you are traveling from somewhere? Or how many of you have speed dial for safety net? Most of my female students who identify themselves as female, they will raise their hand. Again, I am able to ask these questions because I have a lived experience. So the same thing happens in newsrooms. So not necessarily if you it's an activist role, but it's a lived experience role. you have lived through that, so you know the kind of question that you would be able to ask, especially related to sexual harassment and rape and sexual violence.
Yeah, but where again, I have to ask this question because
Sure.
it's my duty.
No, of
But
course.
there has to be a line somewhere, right, where too much of activism, even when it comes to sexual assault, becomes a problem. So how does one go about deciding that line?
I think it's an individual decision. You have to kind of decide yourself, what is it that where do you want to draw the line. So if you ask me very personally, people sharing, like if I'm a journalist, or if I have a public profile, and if I share some of my views like very openly on social media sites or platforms, it will question my objectivity, right? So I think the way to go towards this is follow objectivity in how you are reporting. So using the tools and following it. And then, all of us, we have our own beliefs, right? And then making sure that keeping those two separate, that's the best way to go about it. But also, I would say lived experiences cannot be taken out. Lived experiences are very important especially as far as sexual harassment and sexual assault issues are concerned.
All right. So now let's get into this part where you talk about the transnational hashtag movements, where you basically are talking about, global hashtag movements like Black Lives Matter, or it's for just for example that.
Right.
Now I'll give you my point of view. As I was reading this chapter, I kind of had mixed feelings about this, because I kind of relate to what you're saying, but at the same time, what do you do about this? I mean, as the famous adage that goes in Hindi is jiski lathi uski bhais, right? That's just the way life has been. So how does one, like, even with hashtag me too, I think hashtag Me Too in the United States of America would have a completely different experience and connotation than from a hashtag Me Too, say, in India. In fact, I would go a step further and say, why should India even have a hashtag Me Too? Why can't we have our own thing or our own little thing? And why do we need? It's always, I somehow find it very nauseating where until and unless koi baba aake America se ya Anglosphere se अपना आशीर्वाद नहीं देता है हमारी मूवमेंट को, तब तक हमको ऐसा लगता नहीं है कि हम आ गए हैं, we have arrived. As in, so how do we deal with this dichotomy?
Sure. So let me start with one thing. So one of the movements, LOSHA, in academia, like sexual harassment, list of sexual harassment in academia, that in India, that was started by an Indian student in the US. So that was a movement that originated here. And this is also a perfect example I would like to give of gatekeeping, but she faced a lot of gatekeeping and hierarchy from India. So that is like really, all she wanted to do was, do you remember Raya Sarkar? I write about her as well.
Yeah.
So LOSHA was originally started in the Indian sphere, not in the US sphere. It was picked up here later. So, but she faced a lot of gatekeeping.
So gatekeeping in the sense from Indian feminist activists,
yes.
Senior famous elite feminist activists.
Yeah, there was an open letter against her, and and her list, like it's no longer available on Google, but she was the one who started. But most people still, when they have to refer, they will refer to the LOSHA that started here in the US, right? But she initiated it first. Talking about why can't we have our own movement, I think having an umbrella movement gives visibility. Mm-hmm. That is my personal take. It gives visibility, but I will say, it kind of empowers. Like when you see the Google map, have you seen the Google Trends map of hashtag Me Too? It kind of blips, so many people there. So that kind of gives visibility. But again, what I said earlier, that transnational movements, they kind of travel, but whether they're successful and sustainable, it depends on the local context a lot. And it doesn't reach further in the interior. And I want to quote something. I've used this in my book as well. So the young woman who was raped in Unnao and who lost her family as well, and she was there was an attempt on her life too. So she was interviewed in 2018, October of 2018, by a journalist who asked her about hashtag #MeToo India. And you know what she said? She said, I don't have a phone. I don't watch TV. I have no idea what is going on. I tried to seek justice, but I lost my father. This is what she said. So she has no idea what is going on. And then later, when there was an attempt on her life, her mother, she literally pleaded. She said that, she told journalists in Hindi, like, if you don't, you are the way, like, if you don't talk about us, you deserted us 6 months ago. If you don't talk about us, then who will talk about us? So this, so in rural and semi-rural areas, victims and their families, survivors, victims and their families, they still think that the news media is a platform of justice for them because it helps them to amplify. Because they don't have a lot of times, they don't have access to those platforms, and also they don't know how to effectively use those platforms. So that's why I also say the heart doesn't bleed for everyone. You will come across posts like, but they don't have as many retweets or as many shares. So no one really knows what is happening about them. So I think it's important for, sorry, you were saying something.
No. So I just had a follow-up question, but please
Sure.
complete your point, then I can ask that question.
Yeah, so I do think it's important to have the umbrella movements just to amplify, but also to recognize that it doesn't reach everyone. So it's, I mean, people who can make use of the movements of the hashtags very well, use it. It will help them to amplify their cases. There were so many that happened in newsrooms in 2015, 2008, 2007 that it only came to light after the hashtag #MeToo India movement happened, because they felt empowered to share then. But also realize that it's a kind of privilege to be able to share those. So yeah, go ahead. I don't want to take more time.
So what I was trying to ask you is that in a way it's a double-edged sword. So while there might be a bad side to it for every single tool, like in social media,
Right.
You get terrible trolls who hate on me daily, but you get amazing people too, right?
Right.
So I guess with social media activism is just like any other zone where you're gonna find some people hijacking what you really started, but at the same time, once that tool, albeit being hijacked, still some people can kind of piggyback on it, right? And after piggybacking on it, at least those stories will come out. So I guess you got to take the good and the bad simultaneously then.
Yeah, exactly. And you got to recognize that. You got to recognize that social media is not one size fits all. And I think more and more we are moving away from that discourse that, social media is a great place. It's for everyone, or it helps the marginalized. Yes, it helps the marginalized, but not always. So this not always, this kind of gets lost in translation sometimes. So we have to recognize that it works for many, but it does not work for all.
Yeah, I get it. So now, Pallavi, how does one go about what's the way forward then? Like, let's say if I was to say somebody, what does one learn? What are the lessons that we can learn from these observations about, like, I would recommend everybody to go and buy your book and read chapter 4 ka ek part where Pallavi has done an analysis of 3 particular Facebook pages, where she gets into a very detailed analysis of how these Facebook pages are interwoven with other things and how the digital network flows. It's very interesting. I found it very interesting. But then what is the way forward? You have these international hashtag movements, you have hashtag #MeToo, you have many other movements, but so I'll give you again my experience as someone who has done these things on the ground.
Right.
I think it's a training issue. Sometimes people just don't know. So can there be like organized workshops or training tools where you can actually go to girls in rural India and slums and in lower income groups, albeit anywhere in India, where we can actually create workshops where we can train these girls about how to use WhatsApp effectively, how to use Facebook effectively, what is a hashtag, what is a trend, or are there any kind of efforts being done in those areas? Did you come across them?
No. So first, thank you so much for the shout out, Kusha. And so I am not aware of the workshops, but also at the same time, I want to say that even if they're aware, a lot of times it's not the access related issues. It's because they can't do it. There are other issues. There are they're in closer proximity to their abusers. They can't do it, or if they do it, they can't use public spaces as often. I think the bigger going forward, the bigger take would be including all these fabulous activists who are working on the grassroots level and recognizing them somehow, like making them a part of the larger movement, highlighting on their achievements, right? So I wrote this book. I don't know how many of them are, how many people are going to have access, and how many are going to read the book, but it's just a book. But if the news media and if others who have more access on social media platforms, such as, the influencers, I try to keep my social media at the minimum. But if they focus on these fabulous people who are working day in, day out, and a lot of times I have to say this on your show, Kushal, so that it reaches more people, that many of these women, they sometimes travel, if the police is not taking the FIR for if a woman, when a woman has been raped or sexually violated, and the police is not taking the FIR, there are these women, they will travel from nearby villages so that they can just sit peacefully and picket until the police takes the complaint. These women, if they travel, they will not have the money to have lunch. There's no one sponsoring them. So they are giving up. So these stories of personal sacrifices, someone has to tell these stories. I can only say this to one book. It is only going to reach so many people. So there has to be a way where, and they are not the only ones who are, there are so many who do this. So there has to be a way that we acknowledge them. I mean, today is International Women's Day. Everyone is wishing each other. But is there a way that we can acknowledge these women? Social media doesn't talk about them. News media sometimes does. So someone needs to talk about them, right? So I think going forward, we need to put focus on these women at the grassroots level who are working, the fabulous work that they are doing, and ways to support them and that work. So it comes from the villages, right? So it comes from those rural areas. So right now, as I like to say, we are all in our own bubbles, not just and echo chambers, not just on social media platforms, but also in terms of location. The focus is primarily on urban and urban areas. So, and that's why we are missing so many. So I think that has to be the way forward. Yeah, workshops would be wonderful, but at the same time, this focus on these grassroots activists, that needs to be done.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you know what? All I can do is that if you come across these activists, and if I can, call them on my podcast or just talk about them on my Twitter or on my social media platforms, I will be happily doing that. I always believe in, shining a light on those people that nobody wants to talk about. I did not start this podcast for any other reason. My whole reason was that I want to do things nobody does. Nobody wants to have long conversations in India. So I said, you know what the hell? I'll have long conversations in India. Everybody wants to have 10-minute conversations. मैं 1 घंटा बात करूंगा. So if anybody wants to come, my platform is always open. I will, I want to talk about their work. How do they go about it? And believe me, I can understand all of this only because I myself have busted my ass on the ground working in these areas. In fact, I'll narrate an incident. I think it was 3 years ago. So we used to go into slums and have these food distribution services, where food distribution was just a point of entry where you gain their trust, and then you start and going and understanding their issues and start working. Now, while I was working, I clearly remember having one of those meetings, and at that time I had specifically asked, I want women in the slums to come, and nobody was willing to come. And then I literally, in a very weird way, kind of threatened the men कि मैं आऊंगा नहीं अगर औरतें नहीं आएंगी तो. And they got the women, and then I was like, आप लोगों को क्या चाहिए? Everybody was silent. आदमी बहुत बोल रहे थे, औरतें नहीं बोल रही थी. फिर एक औरत ने मेरे को ऐसे हाथ पकड़ा, इधर आओ. मला हाँ बोलो. She took me to a spot, and she took me on a spot where there were empty beer bottles, and I was like, हाँ तो इसका कुछ कर सकते हो? And I shut up. I had no answer. So in her own weird way, she said, ये जाता है, दबा के दारू पीता है, रात को आता है और मुझे मारता है, इसका क्या कर सकते हो? And honestly, मेरे पास कोई आंसर नहीं था at that time, because I told her कि पुलिस, बोलता पुलिस में जाके क्या करूंगी, रहना भी इसके साथ है. इन चीजों का कोई आंसर नहीं था मेरे पास. And you know why I did not have an answer? Because I did not have any kind of a training, even as an activist, to go and deal with these issues. Later on, I understood that, cops are also smart. They don't jail the husband. They have their own ways of dealing with the husbands who are drunk in India. वो आते हैं, 2-4 चमाट लगा देते हैं, उसको बोलते हैं चल वापस जा, आगे नहीं करना, kind of a thing. So ऐसा नहीं है कि पुलिस कुछ नहीं करती है. Police also kind of do these things. But it hit me at that time. I clearly remember that incident of that lady taking me to a corner and showing me those beer cans and desi daru ke bottles, and so like ये हमारे issues हैं. And honestly, this is where I struggle as a human being on a daily basis. Now, obviously, I'm not going to sit in a corner and leave my life completely. Look, I don't expect anybody to do that. But what I can expect from anybody who watches this podcast and anything, talk about these people once in a month at least. I found this interesting person in this corner of India. Maybe somebody might help them, give them some donation or something. I don't know. I mean, is there any other way we can do it?
That's, I think, yeah, like you said, talk about them, at least, not just on Women's Day, but talk about them. Make sure that you, and not just on social media sites, but also on the news. Talk about them on the news as well, because not everyone is still on social media sites. So maybe through the news they will know what fabulous work they are doing. So amplifying through all platforms, that is really important. And I'm so glad you shared, Kushal, your experience of how this experience of going there in the slum, it had a kind of a jarring impact on yourself because you didn't know how to react. And when I was chatting with, when I was doing the interviews, a lot of times I had this kind of a reaction myself when they were saying, oh, you know what, my profile was blocked on Facebook. And I'm like, aisa bhi hota hai? Because she shared something that is like, completely, it has nothing to do with nudity. So to me as well, I mean, I learned so much from this experience. So I can't just say that I know I am sharing all of this through the book, but the book has been a learning experience for myself. Like, how not anti-sexual violence activism on social media platforms and other than social media platforms impacts the rural and semi-rural area activists as well. So for me, it has been a great learning experience, and I will say it's been a humbling experience as well. It has been a humbling experience. So
Pallavi, before we wrap things up, I actually wanted to ask you one last question. So any new projects coming up? So what are you looking to do now post this book?
So post this work as an academic, we are always working on scholarships and articles, like academic articles. So post this work, my next project, and I am actively still working on it, is how sexual harassment and sexual violence, whether it has been a part of any political campaign during the elections, and how is it received, why or why not. So these are the questions I am currently investigating.
Well, I can assure you, once you're done with that paper, just send it across to me. I'll definitely cover it on the podcast. I would love to cover these kinds of subjects.
Sure, thank you so much. And again, for this, I want to understand how sexual violence, whether it's a part of any political campaign, larger issue, or is it just used to scandalize, or it is used as an issue where there needs to be more policies that need to be made, and how the electorate, they are also kind of looking at it. So yeah, so that's my next work.
All right. So, guys, time to wrap up the podcast. I have left the link to purchase Pallavi's book in the description of the podcast. So it doesn't matter if you're watching it, watching this on YouTube, or if you're going to listen to this on SoundCloud or Spotify or Apple iTunes or whatever, wherever you're going to listen to, just go on the description of the podcast, click on the link and buy Pallavi's book. It is an amazing book. To all you lazy buggers out there who always tell me, Kushal bhai, 400 पेज की बुक recommend करते हो हमेशा पढ़ने को, भाई ये तो 200 पेज की भी नहीं है, तो ये पढ़ लो आलसियों कम से कम. So please go and buy the book. And Pallavi, once again, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Kushal, for the shout out and the opportunity to share, so much about not just my experience, but all of those unsung heroes as well, and shining the spotlight on them as well. Thank you so much, Kushal.
All right, guys, time to wrap things up. If you like what I'm doing over here, please subscribe to the podcast, like the video, share the video, leave a comment over there. Once again, buy Pallavi's book. If you like what I'm doing on the podcast, please become a member of the YouTube channel or subscribe or Patreon. If you want to send direct donations, you can send it directly to Kushal Mehra at ICICI through UPI. And you can buy the Cārvāka podcast merch. Today being 8th of March, I've just launched a special gift for our liberal friends on Holi. So you can go and buy that t-shirt or two. I'll see you next time with another interesting conversation. Until then, namaste. Take care. Good.